A billionaire's life is saved by a homeless man. But when the man mysteriously vanishes, leaving only a cryptic note, the search for answers unravels a web of betrayal, lost fortunes, and a deadly conspiracy. The city never truly sleeps, but in the late hours of the night, its heartbeat slows to a quiet murmur. Jonathan Mercer, a billionaire known for his razor-sharp business acumen and ruthlessness in boardroom negotiations, rarely found himself alone in places like this. Yet, here he was, walking down a dimly lit alleyway behind an exclusive restaurant after a late-night deal had gone longer than expected. His driver was waiting just around the corner, but in those few moments of solitude, fate would deal him an unexpected hand. The attack came swiftly. Two figures emerged from the shadows, their faces partially hidden by the flickering streetlights. One of them pressed a knife against Jonathan's ribs, while the other reached for his watch and wallet. "Easy, man. Just hand it over. And no one gets hurt," one of them hissed. Jonathan wasn't used to fear. He had built an empire from nothing, faced adversaries who would have gladly crushed him, and survived scandals that would have destroyed lesser men. But in this moment, he was vulnerable. No security, no bodyguards, just himself and two desperate criminals. Before he could respond, a third figure appeared. A blur of movement, swift and deliberate. The first assailant barely had time to react before his wrist was twisted at an unnatural angle, forcing him to drop the knife. A fist followed, landing cleanly against his jaw with a force that sent him sprawling onto the wet pavement. The second robber turned, raising a gun, only to have it yanked from his grip in a move so precise it looked practiced. The mysterious stranger twisted his arm back and, in one fluid motion, threw him against the alley wall with a force that knocked the breath from his lungs. Jonathan stumbled back, watching in stunned silence as the two attackers groaned on the ground, incapacitated. The man who had saved him straightened, stepping into the light. He was older, perhaps in his late 50s, with a weathered face and unkempt hair streaked with gray. His clothes were ragged, his beard overgrown, and his eyes, sharp, calculating, and filled with something that Jonathan recognized, a quiet authority. "You all right?" the man asked, his voice rough but steady. Jonathan could only nod, his heart still hammering in his chest. "Good," the stranger muttered before turning to walk away, as if what he had done was nothing unusual. "Wait," Jonathan called after him. "Who are you?" The man hesitated for a moment, then gave a half-smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just someone who used to be somebody," he said, before disappearing into the night. Jonathan, still shaken, checked his pockets. His belongings were untouched, but his perspective had shifted. This man, whoever he was, had saved his life without asking for anything in return. A billionaire being rescued by a homeless man. It was almost poetic. The next morning, Jonathan used his vast resources to track the man down. It didn't take long. His name was Thomas Caldwell, a former financier who had once been among the wealthiest men in the country before he lost everything. There was barely any information about what had happened to him, only vague mentions of a financial scandal years ago, an embezzlement charge, and a disappearance from the public eye. Jonathan arranged for an anonymous donation, enough money for a fresh start, a modest apartment, a bank account filled with funds, and the chance to reclaim his dignity. No press, no publicity, just a silent act of gratitude. But weeks later, when Jonathan tried to check in, Thomas Caldwell was gone. His apartment was empty, his bank account untouched. The only thing left behind was a note scrawled in messy handwriting on the kitchen counter. "You owe me more than you know." Jonathan stared at the words, a strange unease creeping into his chest. What did they mean? And why did he feel as though this was only the beginning? This content may violate our usage policies. Did we get it wrong? Please tell us by giving this response a thumbs down. Jonathan Mercer was a man who thrived on certainty. Numbers, data, trends, these were things he could predict, control, and manipulate to his advantage. But now he found himself confronted with a mystery that refused to fit into any logical equation. Thomas Caldwell had vanished. The money Jonathan had arranged for him remained untouched. The modest apartment he had secured was abandoned without a trace of his presence, save for a single cryptic note. "You owe me more than you know." Jonathan had read the words a dozen times, and each time they sent a chill down his spine. He wasn't sure why, but something about them felt more like a warning than a farewell. With his resources, it didn't take long to start piecing together fragments of Thomas Caldwell's past. Before he had become a ghost of a man wandering the streets, Thomas had been Thomas Caldwell III, the head of Caldwell Financial, a multi-billion-dollar investment firm. A name once spoken with reverence in the financial world, now reduced to nothing more than whispers of scandal and disgrace. But as Jonathan dug deeper, he found inconsistencies in the story. According to public records, Caldwell Financial collapsed overnight due to allegations of embezzlement and fraud. The media at the time had painted Thomas as a financial predator who had gambled away billions of dollars of his investors' money. A high-profile trial was set to begin. But before the case could even reach court, Thomas Caldwell disappeared. No one had seen him since. Something wasn't adding up. If Thomas had truly been the villain the world believed, why had he been living on the streets instead of hiding away with a secret fortune? Why hadn't he fought to clear his name? And why did his message to Jonathan feel so deliberate? Jonathan needed more answers. He reached out to an old acquaintance, Carter Hayes, a retired investigative journalist who had once specialized in corporate fraud cases. If anyone could uncover the truth, it was Carter. After several days of relentless searching, Carter sent Jonathan an encrypted file. You were right. Caldwell didn't just lose his company, he was destroyed. Jonathan opened the file and began reading. The truth buried in lies. Thomas Caldwell had been set up. A series of internal documents, leaked emails, and forged financial reports painted a much different story than the one the world had been told. Someone had engineered the downfall of Caldwell Financial, systematically shifting blame onto Thomas while draining the company's accounts into offshore shell corporations. But the most damning evidence of all, the person who orchestrated the entire collapse was someone still very much active in the financial world. Jonathan froze as he saw the name. Victor Langley. Jonathan's pulse quickened. Victor Langley was not just another businessman. He was one of Jonathan's own business partners, a major stakeholder in Mercer Enterprises, and a man he had considered a friend for years. The betrayal hit Jonathan like a punch to the gut. Langley had framed Thomas, stolen his empire, and vanished him from existence. And now, without realizing it, Jonathan himself had been working alongside the very man responsible. A deep unease settled in his chest. Thomas Caldwell knew. That was why he had disappeared. That was why he had left the note. And that was why Jonathan could no longer ignore this mystery. He had to find Thomas Caldwell before it was too late. The Betrayal Uncovered. Jonathan Mercer had spent his entire career navigating the cutthroat world of high finance, where alliances were temporary and betrayal was just another business strategy. But this was something else entirely. Victor Langley. A man he had trusted. A man who sat at his boardroom table, who had shaken his hand on billion-dollar deals. And yet, Victor had been responsible for the destruction of Thomas Caldwell, the man who had saved Jonathan's life. The more Jonathan thought about it, the more he realized just how dangerous Victor really was. If he had been willing to orchestrate the downfall of one of the most powerful financial moguls in the country, what else had he done? How many other bodies were buried beneath his empire? And most importantly, was Jonathan next? A mansion full of ghosts. Determined to find the truth, Jonathan retraced Thomas Caldwell's past, following a lead to what had once been his family estate, a sprawling, now abandoned mansion on the outskirts of the city. It was a forgotten relic of wealth and power, its gates rusted, the grand entrance overgrown with vines. As Jonathan stepped inside, the air was thick with dust, the scent of decay clinging to every corner. He moved through the empty halls, his footsteps echoing against marble floors. Paintings had been removed, furniture covered with white sheets. It was as if someone had erased Thomas Caldwell's entire existence. But then, in what had once been Thomas's study, Jonathan found something, a hidden compartment behind an old bookshelf. Inside, there were stacks of documents, some yellowed with age, others recent. Bank transfers, emails, memos, and the name that appeared over and over again, Victor Langley. One document stood out, a detailed contract, a buyout deal signed under duress, stripping Thomas of his ownership stake in Caldwell Financial. The signature at the bottom, hastily scrawled, was his, but beneath it, in small print, was a chilling clause. Any attempt to contest the terms of this agreement shall result in the release of criminal evidence implicating Thomas Caldwell in fraudulent activities, punishable by federal law. Jonathan exhaled slowly. This was it. The smoking gun. Victor had blackmailed Thomas, forcing him to sign away his empire under threat of fabricated evidence. And once Thomas had nothing left, Victor ensured that he could never fight back, making him a fugitive in his own country. But there was more. As Jonathan sifted through the remaining documents, he found an old surveillance photo. It showed two men standing in a parking garage. One of them was Thomas Caldwell. The other was Victor Langley. Jonathan's stomach dropped. The date on the photo was the night before Thomas disappeared. The trap had already been set. Jonathan's mind raced. If Victor had met with Thomas that night, what had really happened? The official story was that Thomas vanished of his own accord, too ashamed to face his alleged crimes. But what if that wasn't the case? What if Victor had planned for him to disappear? What if Thomas Caldwell hadn't just lost everything? What if he had been meant to die? A creaking sound made Jonathan's blood run cold. He wasn't alone. Slowly he turned toward the doorway. A shadow shifted in the dim light, and from the darkness a familiar voice spoke. "You shouldn't be here, Jonathan." Victor Langley. Dressed in a sharp navy suit, he stood with the ease of a man who knew he was in control. Jonathan's jaw tightened. "Funny, I was about to say the same thing to you." Victor sighed, stepping forward, his expression unreadable. "You're a smart man, Jonathan. That's why I liked you, but you've been digging into things you shouldn't." Jonathan clenched his fists. "You destroyed him." Victor smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "I made a choice. The same choice you'd make if it came down to you or someone else. Survival, Jonathan. That's all this is." There was something terrifying about the calmness in Victor's voice. It was the voice of a man who had done terrible things and felt nothing. Jonathan didn't flinch. "He's still alive." Victor tilted his head, amused. "Is he?" Jonathan wasn't sure if it was a question or a threat, but one thing was clear. He had just become a problem for Victor Langley, and problems like him, they didn't stay alive for long. Jonathan Mercer had faced ruthless adversaries before, corporate sharks, billion-dollar lawsuits, hostile takeovers, but none of them compared to the threat standing before him now. Victor Langley, a man who had orchestrated the downfall of Thomas Caldwell, stolen his empire, and erased him from existence. Now, Victor stood in the doorway of the abandoned mansion, exuding the calm authority of someone who had been in control for far too long. "You've been busy," Victor mused, stepping further into the room. "Digging through old ghosts, chasing a man who's already lost." Jonathan held his ground. "You framed Thomas. You destroyed his life and made sure he could never fight back." Victor smiled slightly, as if amused by the accusation. "Destroyed?" "Number. He made his own mistakes. I just made sure those mistakes buried him before he could bury me." Jonathan felt his pulse quicken. There was no remorse in Victor's voice, no hesitation. He had built his empire on deception, and now Jonathan knew too much, and Victor knew it too. "Let's not pretend you don't understand how this works, Jonathan," Victor continued. "If you keep pushing, you won't like what happens next." Jonathan's jaw clenched. He had no doubt what Victor meant. This wasn't just about Thomas anymore. If Victor had taken down one powerful man before, there was nothing stopping him from doing it again. Vanishes Gamble. Jonathan needed to act fast. He had proof that Thomas had been framed, but it wasn't enough. If he wanted to take Victor down, he needed undeniable, irrefutable evidence. Something so damning that even Victor's influence couldn't bury it. That night, Jonathan reached out to the only person who could help, Thomas Caldwell himself. It took time, but Jonathan finally tracked him down. Thomas had been living off the grid, avoiding anything that could bring attention to him. He was hesitant to meet, but when Jonathan told him what he had found, the silence on the other end of the line was enough to confirm what he already knew. Thomas had never stopped looking over his shoulder. The two men met in a secluded location outside the city. Thomas was thinner than before, his face lined with the weight of years spent in hiding, but his eyes were still sharp. "You shouldn't have come looking for me," Thomas said, his voice low. "You didn't deserve what happened," Jonathan replied, "and I'm going to make sure Victor pays for it." Thomas exhaled, shaking his head. "You don't get it. You think this is just about me? Victor isn't working alone. There are people in power who helped him do this, people who don't want the truth to come out." Jonathan's stomach turned. He had underestimated the scale of this. This wasn't just about corporate greed. This was about systemic corruption, the kind that could ruin anyone who stood in its way. And he had just painted a target on his back. The final move. Despite the risks, Jonathan refused to back down. He set a trap, a fake billion-dollar merger deal designed to lure Victor into signing incriminating documents that would expose his entire scheme. But Victor was just as cunning. On the night of the meeting, Jonathan received an anonymous message: "Call it off, or you won't live to see morning." He ignored it. As he stepped into the boardroom, he knew this was it. Either he would end Victor Langley, or Victor would end him. Jonathan Mercer walked into the boardroom of Mercer Enterprises with the weight of a storm behind his eyes. This was the moment everything had been leading up to. The moment he would either expose Victor Langley and bring him to justice or become the next victim in a long line of men who had underestimated him. Victor was already seated at the long mahogany table, his suit pristine, his expression unreadable. Around him sat a handful of executives, their eyes flickering between the two men with carefully concealed unease. They could sense the tension, but had no idea of the war happening beneath the surface. Jonathan slid a thick folder across the table. "This is the revised agreement for the Mercer-Langley merger," he said smoothly. "Once you sign it, the deal will be finalized." Victor's lips twitched upward. "I knew you'd see reason, Jonathan. A man like you understands that survival is about making the right choices." Jonathan kept his expression neutral. "Yes, the right choices." Victor reached for the pen, but just before he could sign, Jonathan added, "Of course, I had my legal team review everything one last time. You know, to be sure it's all airtight." Victor froze for half a second. So subtle most wouldn't have noticed, but Jonathan did. He knew. Victor continued signing, but his grip on the pen had tightened slightly. Jonathan leaned back, waiting. 30 seconds later, the boardroom doors burst open. FBI agents swarmed in, their badges flashing under the fluorescent lights. The executives gasped, pushing back their chairs in shock. Victor, to his credit, barely flinched. "Victor Langley," an agent said firmly, "you're under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, and corporate espionage." The moment the words left his mouth, the room turned to chaos. Some executives stood frozen, their faces pale as they realized the implications. Others scrambled to distance themselves, already planning how to protect their own careers. Jonathan, however, never took his eyes off Victor. 2 agents pulled him to his feet and began cuffing him, but Victor remained eerily calm. He turned his gaze toward Jonathan, and for the first time, his mask of confidence slipped just enough for Jonathan to see something underneath. Not fear, amusement. He leaned in slightly as the agents led him away and murmured, "You really think this ends with me?" Jonathan held his ground. "Number, but it starts with you." Victor chuckled under his breath before being escorted out, leaving a void of silence in his wake. A man who never existed. An hour later, Jonathan stood outside in the cold evening air, watching as the last of the FBI vehicles disappeared down the street. A figure stepped out of the shadows nearby, Thomas Caldwell. He looked at Jonathan with something resembling both relief and disbelief. "I wasn't sure you'd actually pull it off," Jonathan smirked. "Neither was I." Thomas sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "You've just made enemies you can't even see yet." Jonathan exhaled. "Maybe. But I also made a choice. The right one." Thomas studied him for a long moment, then reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope. Jonathan frowned as he took it. Inside was a single folded note. "This time, don't forget who you are." Jonathan looked up, but Thomas was already walking away. "Where will you go?" Jonathan called after him. Thomas didn't stop, didn't turn. He just disappeared into the night. A man who had once ruled the financial world, but had learned that sometimes the best kind of power is the freedom to walk away. Jonathan glanced down at the note again, feeling its weight, not just in his hands, but in his soul. Victor had been right about one thing. This wasn't over. There were more people behind the curtain, pulling strings, watching, waiting. But Jonathan Mercer had made his decision. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of what came next.